The archive station was old, very old, the kind of old that made the walls creak even in the silence of deep space, where there was no wind to push them and no reason for them to make any sound at all. The lights inside flickered every few minutes, not because anything was broken, but simply because the station had been running so long that even its electrical systems had grown tired. Thessaly Vorn did not mind the flickering. She had been working in dim and strange places for most of her academic life. She had 4 eyes, 2 large ones in front and 2 smaller ones on the sides of her wide, flat head, and all 4 of them were perfectly capable of reading in low light. It was one of the small advantages of being an Ethan in a galaxy full of species who needed bright rooms and loud machines to feel comfortable. She sat in a narrow chair in front of a terminal that was older than her grandmother, scrolling through file after file of cartography records. Her fingers moved quickly. Her 2 front eyes were fixed on the screen. Her 2 side eyes wandered around the room out of habit, watching for nothing in particular. She was supposed to be here for routine work. The Conclave Cartography Guild, the organization that employed her as an intern, had sent her to this decommissioned archive station on the edge of the Drenvar system to recover old survey files and transfer them to the new central database. It was boring work. It was the kind of work that was given to interns precisely because it was boring, and no senior cartographer wanted to spend 3 weeks floating in a dead station copying files. Thessaly had not complained. She liked old things. She liked quiet places. And she liked, more than almost anything else, the feeling of finding something unexpected in a place where nothing interesting was supposed to exist. She found it on the 9th day. It was buried under 12 layers of standard survey archives, dust accumulation reports, gravitational drift logs, routine stellar mapping files that hadn't been opened in over 200 years. She almost missed it. Her finger was already moving to the next folder when something caught the attention of her lower left eye. A file name that didn't match the others. Everything else had long system-generated codes full of numbers and dashes. This file had a name. It was called Prime Survey Original Do Not Transfer, Do Not Copy, Do Not Read. Thessaly stared at it for a moment. She read it. In her defense, anyone would have. The file took nearly 4 minutes to open. The station's processor was old, and the file itself was enormous, far larger than any survey document had any business being. When it finally loaded, Thessaly leaned forward without thinking, her front eyes widening. It was a map. But it was not like any map in the Conclave's current database. The maps she worked with every day had a blank gray region near the outer edge of the western spiral arm. Every map had it. It was simply there, like a hole in a page, and nobody talked about it much. The notation along its border said the region was uncharted, and that surveyor access had been suspended under something called Conclave Directive 1 Prime. Thessaly had seen that notation hundreds of times. It had never interested her. Lots of regions were uncharted. Space was large. But this map, this old hidden do not read map, did not have a gray region. It had stars. Hundreds of them. Bright, detailed, fully mapped stars with names and coordinates and population data, and atmospheric readings and notes about resources and trade potential. An entire civilization's worth of stellar geography, mapped out in careful detail by surveyors who had clearly spent enormous time and effort doing their job properly. And at the center of all those stars, in letters that were bold and clear, and had clearly survived multiple attempts at deletion that had all somehow failed, were 2 words. Human space. Thessaly sat back in her chair. She looked at the screen for a long time without moving. Then she looked over her right shoulder, then her left. Then she checked both side-eye views out of pure reflex, even though she already knew the room was empty and the station had no other inhabitants. She looked at the screen again. Human space, she said out loud very quietly to nobody. The station hummed and flickered. She did not close the file. She knew she should have. The file had 3 clear warnings on it, and one of them used the word forbidden in 4 different languages. Thessaly had always had a complicated relationship with warnings. She respected them in the way that someone respects a very large dog. She took them seriously. She did not provoke them carelessly, but she also did not simply walk away without understanding what she was dealing with. She started reading. The survey data was old, older than she had expected. Some of it dated back over 1,000 years, to the early expansion period when the conclave was still young and its member species were still learning to work together and map the galaxy with shared tools. The earliest entries were simple: a few scout probes sent into the western spiral arm, returning data about a yellow star and a small rocky system orbiting it. Standard findings, nothing alarming. Then the notes changed. The scout probe sent to the 3rd planet of the yellow star detected something unexpected: radio signals, structured ones, the kind that only came from thinking beings. This was not unusual in the early conclave era. New species were being discovered regularly. The surveyors had logged it with professional excitement and flagged it for contact protocol. The contact protocol sent a larger ship. The larger ship came back with a report that Thessaly read twice before she was sure she understood it correctly. The species on the 3rd planet, which called itself humanity and called its planet Earth, was friendly. It was curious. It wanted to communicate, and it did so quickly and well once both sides worked out a shared language. It had no faster-than-light travel yet, but its people were clearly intelligent and its technology was advancing fast. None of that was the problem. The problem was everything else the surveyors had found, because Earth, they reported, was not what any of them had expected. It was not the technology that unsettled the early surveyors. Humanity's technology was young by galactic standards, interesting, occasionally creative, but nothing that could threaten a conclave exploration vessel. It was not the size of the human population, which was large for a single planet species but not extraordinary. It was the wars. Humanity, the surveyors reported with the kind of careful, measured language that people use when they are trying very hard not to sound frightened, had been at war with itself for its entire recorded history. Not small conflicts, not border disputes between city-states. The survey team had accessed human historical records, and what they found inside those records was something that most surveyor teams never encountered on a first contact mission. Humanity had fought wars that covered the entire surface of its planet. It had developed weapons capable of ending all life on Earth and then chose, on at least a dozen occasions throughout its history, not to use them. Not because it couldn't, because it decided not to. The distinction was noted in the surveyor's log with 3 exclamation points, which was unusual for a professional document. Humans healed from injuries that would kill most species, not because they had extraordinary medicine, though they did develop medicine quickly, but because their bodies were, in the words of the survey team's biology specialist, stubbornly difficult to stop. A human could lose large amounts of blood and still function, could survive temperatures that would incapacitate most conclave species, could go without sleep or food for periods that the biology specialist described as genuinely alarming. They also ran, not away from things, though they did that too, but for no reason at all, just for the activity of it, sometimes for very long distances over very difficult ground. The biology specialist had spent 6 pages of the report trying to explain this and had eventually given up and written. They appear to enjoy it. I do not have a better explanation. Thessaly scrolled through page after page of this. Hours passed without her noticing. The early survey team had not recommended conquest or avoidance. They had recommended careful, slow contact. Let humanity develop. Watch it grow. Introduce it to the conclave gradually, in stages, giving it time to adjust to the knowledge that it was not alone in the universe. It was a good recommendation, a sensible one, the kind of recommendation that experienced people make when they have thought carefully about a situation. It was never followed. Instead, 200 years after the first contact file was written, there was a different entry in the archive. Shorter, more formal, written in the dry, official language of Conclave Administrative Decree. It was the original text of Directive 1 Prime, and it said, in summary, the following. All survey activity in the Western Spiral Arm region designated as human space was to be suspended indefinitely. No conclave vessel was to cross the border into human space without express permission from the Conclave High Council. All existing maps of human space were to be reclassified and removed from public circulation. The region would be marked as uncharted on all standard charts. There was no explanation, no incident report attached, no reason given, just the directive signed by 17 High Council members, every one of whom had written their signature with the kind of firm, deliberate pressure that suggested they were very certain about what they were doing. Thessaly searched the archive for an explanation and found, instead, something almost worse. Nothing. No record of what had happened. No report of an incident. Just a gap, a clean, deliberate, carefully maintained gap, where the reason should have been. Someone had removed it so completely that even the removal itself had been removed. She leaned back in her chair and pressed two of her hands against her face, which was what Ethans did when they were overwhelmed. "What happened to you?" she whispered to the map. The map did not answer. The lights flickered, the station hummed. She spent the next 2 days going through everything in the archive that was even slightly connected to the Western Spiral Arm, or to anything that might have triggered Directive 1 Prime. She found fragments, pieces of things, an old diplomatic communication from a species called the Vreth that mentioned recent activities near the outer arm border, without saying what those activities were. A navigation update that rerouted 3 major trade lanes away from human space, with no explanation, beyond a reference number that pointed to a file that no longer existed. A biology research paper from a conclave medical university that had been citing a study on human physiology. The citation was still there, but the study itself had been removed. It was like reading a book where someone had cut out every page that contained the most important parts of the story. But there were smaller things that had been left behind, perhaps by accident, perhaps because whoever had done the cleaning had grown tired or careless near the end. A surveyor's personal journal, appended to the back of an otherwise empty administrative file. A single paragraph in a diplomatic memo that had survived because it was buried at the bottom of a much longer document about something completely unrelated. The journal entry was from a surveyor named Sel Tavar, and it was dated roughly 800 years ago, well after Directive 1 Prime had been issued. It read, "Passed near the border today, did not cross, nobody crosses, but I could see 2 of their ships from the observation deck, long, heavy things with shapes that don't match anything in the design catalog. They didn't hail us, didn't come toward us, just sat there on their side of the line, watching. I asked the captain if we should report them. She said we should look away, set a course for Drenvar, and never speak of this again. So I'm writing it down instead, because I don't think things that are real should disappear just because someone is afraid of them." Thessaly read the entry 3 times. The diplomatic memo paragraph was shorter, written by an ambassador whose name had been redacted, addressed to the Conclave Trade Committee roughly 300 years ago. It said only, "I strongly advise against any further economic actions targeting human space. We do not fully understand what we are dealing with, and I do not think we want to. Some borders are drawn not by walls but by wisdom. This is one of them." On the 3rd day, Thessaly did something she had been putting off because she knew it would make everything harder to ignore. She cross-referenced the star data from the hidden map against the current public charts. The calculation took her terminal most of the morning. When it finished, the results sat on her screen in plain numbers that were very easy to understand. Human space, based on the original survey data, contained 412 star systems. The majority had planets. Many of those planets had been flagged in the old surveys as inhabited, or capable of being inhabited, or already showing signs of development. Humanity had been a spacefaring species for at least several centuries by now, based on the development timeline in the early contact files. 412 systems, an entire civilization, sitting right there on the western edge of the known galaxy, behind a gray patch on a map, while the rest of the conclave went about its daily business and quietly, carefully, collectively refused to look. Thessaly saved a copy of the original map to a personal drive, tucked the drive into the inner pocket of her work jacket, and then sat for a long time thinking about what she was going to do next. The sensible thing, the safe thing, was to finish her transfer assignment, pack her tools, file her routine report, and go back to Conclave Central Station and never mention the archive file to anyone for the rest of her life. She thought about the surveyor named Sel Tavar who had written things down because they deserved to be real. She thought about the clean, deliberate gap where the reason for Directive 1 Prime should have been. She thought about 412 stars and the civilization living among them that the rest of the galaxy had agreed, without ever having a meeting about it, to simply pretend did not exist. She closed the terminal, she packed her tools, she filed her routine report. She kept the drive in her inner pocket all the way back to Conclave Central Station. And she started asking questions. The first thing Thessaly learned, once she began asking carefully, quietly, in the way that she had learned to ask things when she wanted answers and not just polite refusals, was that she was not the only one who knew. There were others. Not many, and they did not talk openly, but they existed, older cartographers who had noticed the gray patch and been told to leave it alone, historians who had found fragments of the old survey records and quietly set them aside rather than report them, a retired conclave diplomat who had been stationed near the Western Arm early in her career and who, when Thessaly found her and sat across from her in a small tea house on Verath Station and asked a careful question, went very still for a moment and then said, "You found the archive file?" "Yes," Thessaly said. The old diplomat looked out the tea house window at the docking bay beyond it, where ships came and went in the ordinary business of a busy station. She was quiet for a long time. "Then you know there are stars behind the gray patch," she said finally. "Yes." "And you want to know why we don't go there?" "Yes." The old diplomat looked at her with the expression of someone who has spent a very long time being careful about something and is now weighing, in real time, whether to stop being careful. "I can tell you what I know," she said, "but I want you to understand something first. What I know is not the whole story. What anyone knows is not the whole story. The whole story is behind that gray patch, and it has been there for 800 years, and the reason no one has gone to get it is not because they couldn't." She paused. "It is because every time someone seriously considered it, someone else in the room who was older and wiser and had seen more of the galaxy would look at them very quietly and say, 'I wouldn't.' And that was always enough." Thessaly leaned forward. "But why?" she asked. "What is over there that frightens an entire galaxy into silence?" The old diplomat picked up her tea. "That," she said, "is exactly the right question, and I am very sorry to tell you that answering it is going to take more courage than either of us might have." She drank. The station hummed around them. Somewhere outside, a ship was powering up its engines, preparing to go somewhere mapped and known and safe. Thessaly kept her hands very still on the table and thought about the drive in her pocket, and the map on it, and the 412 stars that were waiting, in the gray patch, for someone brave enough to look. The old diplomat's name was Senna Rao, and she had seen more of the galaxy than most people twice her age. She had worked border stations, trade negotiations, first contact follow-ups, and the kind of quiet diplomatic missions that were never written up in official records because they went wrong in ways that no one wanted to explain later. She had white ridges along the back of her neck that turned pale when she was stressed, and for the entirety of her first conversation with Thessaly Vorn, they were very pale indeed. She did not tell Thessaly everything at once. That was not how Senna Rao did things. She told things in layers, like someone carefully removing old bandaging from a wound slowly, watching for the flinch, adjusting the speed based on what she saw. The first layer was this. The gray patch had a name among the older diplomatic corps. They called it the Quiet Border. Not human space, not the uncharted region, not anything that appeared in any official document. Just the quiet border, spoken in low voices in private rooms, always with a small pause before and after the words, the way you might speak the name of something you respected enough to handle carefully. "Why quiet?" Thessaly asked. "Because nothing loud has ever come out of it," Senna said. "No broadcasts, no territorial claims, no aggressive movements, no demands, complete silence from their side and complete silence from ours by agreement." She tilted her head. "Though I always thought the name was a little dishonest. Quiet suggests peace. What it really means is that both sides are very deliberately not making noise." "Both sides," Thessaly repeated. "So they know about us, they know we're out here." Senna gave her a look that said this was perhaps the most obvious question she had ever been asked. Of course they know. They have known for centuries. They were the ones who detected the Conclave's early survey probes. Their astronomers identified our ships before our ships identified their planet. She paused. They have simply chosen, as we have, not to make a formal event of it. "Why?" "That," Senna said, "is what I am going to try to explain to you. And I want you to understand that I am not entirely certain my explanation is correct. I am only certain that it is the closest thing to correct that I have found." She started with the Vreth. The Vreth hegemony was not today a major power in the Conclave. It occupied a modest set of star systems in the Eastern Arm, was known primarily for its shipbuilding industry, and participated in Conclave politics with the quiet, unremarkable efficiency of a species that had learned at great cost not to reach too far. But 800 years ago, the Vreth hegemony had been the dominant military force in the known galaxy. It had the largest fleet, the most advanced weapons, the most aggressive foreign policy, and it had, roughly 8 centuries in the past, decided that the Western Spiral Arm, including whatever was inside the gray patch, belonged to it. The Vreth fleet that crossed into human space numbered 4,000 warships. Thessaly had read a fragment of this in the archive, but Senna had more detail, drawn from sources she declined to name, and documents she described only as very old and very private. The fleet crossed the border on a clear mission: survey, claim, and if necessary, conquer. The Vreth were experienced at this. They had done it 6 times before with other species and other regions, and it had always worked out in their favor because the Vreth were disciplined and organized, and had more firepower than anything they had ever encountered. What happened next was recorded by the single Vreth ship that came back. The humans had no fleet of comparable size. What they had was smaller, older, and by all technical measurements significantly less advanced than what the Vreth had brought. They should have, by any reasonable military calculation, simply lost. They did not lose. What the Vreth records described, in language that Senna said became increasingly strange and agitated as the account progressed, was that the humans simply did not behave the way an outnumbered force was supposed to behave. They did not retreat to defensible positions and sue for terms. They did not surrender when their losses became severe. They did not follow any of the tactical patterns that the Vreth military strategists had built their models around, because all of those models were built on the assumption that at some point, a losing side would accept that it was losing. The humans did not accept this. They fought in small groups and large groups. They adapted their tactics mid-battle, sometimes in ways that the Vreth commanders described as making no logical sense, and then 3 hours later turned out to make terrible sense. When one approach failed, they tried something different. When their ships were damaged, they kept the damaged ships in the fight rather than pulling them back. When their pilots were exhausted, they fought exhausted. Senna paused here and looked at Thessaly carefully. The Vreth Admiral's personal log was part of the document set I read. He was not an emotional man. He had fought in 7 campaigns and was famous for his cold judgment. But there is a section of his log, written on the 6th day of the engagement, where he describes watching a single human vessel, a small one, heavily damaged, one of its main drives clearly dead, continue to maneuver and fight and refuse to retreat or go silent. And he wrote, "I do not understand what keeps it moving. By every measure I have, it should have stopped. But it has not stopped. It will not stop. I am beginning to think it will not stop until there is nothing left of it at all. This is not how war is supposed to work." Thessaly sat quietly. "The Vreth fleet withdrew after 3 months," Senna continued. "They had lost more than 3,000 ships. The humans had lost more proportionally because they had less to begin with. But they were still fighting when the Vreth turned around. Still fighting." She let that sit for a moment. The surviving Vreth ship reached home carrying the survivors of the campaign and a note. A physical note on actual paper, written by hand. It said, and this I have memorized because I think it is one of the most important sentences ever written in the history of the galaxy. "We have returned your people. Please don't do this again. From Earth." The tea house was very quiet. Outside, ships moved in the docking bay, going about their ordinary business. "Please don't do this again," Thessaly said softly. "A threat," Senna said. "Not a demand, not a declaration of war or a list of terms, just a request, polite, almost gentle." She picked up her tea, found it was empty, and set it down again. The Vreth never went back. And when other species learned what had happened, and they did learn because these things always spread, even when everyone is trying to keep them quiet, they decided, one by one, that the western spiral arm was perhaps a part of the galaxy that didn't need exploring. The second story was about the Solin Merchant Collective, and it was different in character, but in some ways even more disturbing. The Solin were traders. They had no interest in conquest. What they had interest in was control, specifically, the kind of control that came from managing the flow of goods and resources across large regions of space. When they identified human space as a region they didn't control, their response was not military, it was commercial. They simply rerouted every trade lane that passed near human space, cut off any conclave merchant who attempted to do business in the Western Arm, and issued quiet notices to their partners, suggesting that commerce in that direction would be commercially inadvisable. It was, Senna explained, a very sophisticated economic stranglehold, the kind that the Solin had used before to bring entire systems into their commercial network. It worked by isolation, cut a region off from trade, watch its economy weaken, and eventually they come to you. The Solin embargo of human space lasted 6 months. In those 6 months, humanity did not weaken. What it did instead was, in Senna's words, deeply confusing to everyone who watched it happen. The humans looked at the disruption to their trade and treated it as a problem to solve rather than a crisis to survive. Within 2 months, they had established their own internal trade network across their 400 star systems, faster and better organized than the fragmentary one they'd had before, because the embargo had forced them to sit down and actually build something solid. Within 4 months, they had identified conclave worlds that were also being poorly served by Solin trade routes and had found ways to offer them better terms, not through aggression, but simply by being cheaper and faster and more reliable. Within 6 months, they were undercutting Solin prices on 12 core worlds, and the Solin had gone from choking human space to watching their own market share quietly disappear into the Western Arm. The Solin ended the embargo without announcement or explanation. They simply stopped, rerouted their trade lanes back the way they had been, and began a period of quiet, internal reorganization that their economic historians would later describe as a necessary recalibration. Thessaly found herself almost smiling. They tried to strangle humans economically, and the humans accidentally improved their own economy in the process. Not accidentally, Senna said, and she did not smile. That is what you must understand. It was not luck. It was not accident. Every single thing the humans did during that 6-month period was a direct, practical response to the situation they were in. They looked at a problem and they worked on it. And they did not stop working on it until it was solved. And then they kept going because once they were working, they found other problems nearby that were also worth solving. She leaned forward slightly. The Solon are very intelligent beings. They are patient and strategic and have centuries of experience in commercial warfare. What they were not prepared for was an opponent who looked at their strategy, a strategy specifically designed to create despair and submission, and treated it as an interesting challenge. There were smaller stories too, and Thessaly collected them over the days and weeks that followed her first conversation with Senna. She found them in fragments and pieces, in the way she had learned to look for things quietly from the sides, without asking direct questions that made people shut down. A Kreth deep survey drone that had been lost in a navigation error and crossed the border into human space. It came back 3 months later, not just found, but repaired. More than repaired. Several of its systems had been upgraded with modifications that the Kreth engineers who received it did not recognize and spent the next several years studying. Attached to the drone, secured with care to the outside of its hull, was a small sealed container. Inside the container were objects that took some time to identify. Small, round, brown-baked objects made from a grain product mixed with a form of processed sugar crystal, and something the Kreth food chemist called a fat derivative of likely animal origin. The note attached to the container said only, "Found your drone, fixed some things, thought you might like these. Station crew, Outpost 7. The Kreth engineers ate the cookies cautiously, and then, reportedly, ate all of them. The modifications to the drone were eventually incorporated into 3 generations of subsequent Kreth survey vessel designs. There was the story of a Conclave passenger liner that had suffered a catastrophic navigation failure near the border and crossed 3 light-years into human space before its emergency systems managed to stop it. Human ships had reached it within hours. They had provided power, medical assistance, and enough supplies to get the liner home. They had charged nothing. They had asked for nothing. The only thing they had requested was that the liner captain confirm the names and home worlds of all passengers, which Senna said had confused everyone until someone with enough historical knowledge pointed out that the humans appeared to be checking whether any of their own people were aboard. A habit, apparently, of never leaving their own behind if they could help it. There was the story of the border incident near the Tenvar Reach, when a Conclave military patrol had misjudged its position in an ion storm and found itself facing a human defense station. The patrol captain had expected confrontation. What she got instead was a patient, clear communication on an open channel in perfect Conclave standard language, offering to help the patrol navigate out of the storm and back to its correct position. The station operator had even provided updated weather data for the region as a courtesy. None of these stories were in any official record. They lived in the personal accounts of the people who had been there, passed from ship crew to ship crew across generations, growing a little with each telling but never losing the quality at their core, which was the quality of something true. It was Senna, at their 3rd meeting, who gave Thessaly the piece that connected all the other pieces. "You have been asking the wrong question," Senna said. Not unkindly, she said it the way a good teacher says it, with enough gentleness that it landed as information rather than criticism. Thessaly looked at her. "What do you mean?" "You have been asking what humans have done that frightens the galaxy. You have been collecting the incidents, the Vreth fleet, the Solon embargo, the drone, the liner, and looking for the common threat, the weapon, the capability, the thing that makes them dangerous." Senna shook her head. But that is not what the stories are about. Thessaly waited. The Vreth fleet did not turn back because humans were too powerful to fight. They turned back because they were too exhausting to fight. Because fighting them felt like fighting something that would simply never end, and that feeling was more frightening than any weapon the humans actually carried. Senna folded her hands on the table. The Solon did not end their embargo because they were beaten. They ended it because they were outworked by a civilization that looked at a serious problem and treated it as something interesting rather than something hopeless. The drone was not sent back as a show of power. It was sent back because humans found a broken thing and their instinct was to fix it. The liner